Okay, second session for me today, and this is pretty much, it's also a bit related to the session of this morning. So now we will talk about REST as a focus. So one of the, as you have seen on the slides in this morning, one area of one key development area for APEX 5.2 is REST as well. So let's first, who of you has already worked with external web services? Let's first do the broader picture. Who of you already has worked with external web services in APEX? Who did work with REST services, actually? Also a few. And since the third question would be, how did you do it? But I can imagine the answer, since APEX doesn't provide much declarative support for RESTful service, you have done it pretty much all yourself, right? I assume you have used the APEX web service package to get the JSON or XML data, and then you used some sort of custom coding to parse the data and to process it within your APEX application. Okay. First of all, a very brief and for sure an incomplete introduction to REST. Complete introductions to REST would take then at least an hour, because the purists, there is a lot to know about RESTful services, but we will just focus on the absolute important things. So one thing is that REST is not a protocol. I think that's really an important thing to know. There is SOAP, and many refer to SOAP as the old style of web services and REST as the new style of web services. And that's wrong, right? It's really comparing apple with pies. That doesn't work. SOAP is really a web service protocol. With SOAP is there to do a remote procedure call. So we have one system over there on the remote, you have your local system, and you are using SOAP to call a procedure on the remote system. It's doing a remote procedure call. What we did with Corba 20 years ago, SOAP is a web-based architecture for that. So it's defined to use the HTTP protocol to send XML documents over the wire and to have the remote procedure being executed and the results transferred back. And SOAP, therefore, also contains a lot of functionality or facilities for that. So SOAP, for instance, describes data types or describes a way how to describe the response. Right? That's part of the standard. So there's the WSDL document, which is the service description. And that's an XML grammar, and that describes what attributes are going into the web service, what is going out of the web service, and what data types does that have. That's SOAP, and this actually, it works pretty well, right? REST, on the other hand, is not a protocol for RESTful services, and you can see that when you compare it to SOAP, there is no service description language for REST. There are some ideas for standardizing that. There is Swagger, but it's not like SOAP. And those missing things. So what's happening now in the standardization and in the IT industry, that ideas and implementations and that the final end standards are coming up to fill the gaps between REST and SOAP, because REST initially was never a protocol for web services. REST was more like it's described here, an architectural style for interoperating computer systems. So REST is the architectural style of the internet, actually. So whenever you use your browser to call a web page or to read a web page, you are executing a REST request, all right? When you look at the characteristics of a RESTful service and check whether this applies to the website you are working with, yes, this matches, right? The REST, you can describe a REST interface based on this REST triangle, and these three areas make up a RESTful interface. So it's described with a resource. So there is one identifier, the URI, which uniquely identifies the resource we are talking to, and applied to your favorite website, it has a URL, and that uniquely identifies your favorite website for over the world. right? As long as when it's facing the internet, it has to. Not necessarily for your intranet pages, but then the URL uniquely identifies it within your intranet, so within the universe you are living in, right? So that's the resource. Then you are using a method to talk to the RESTful API, and the method is also a verb, so that it identifies what are we going to do with the resource. And in the web world, the typical verbs are get, put, post, delete. And back to your website, you're doing a get. And get is defined as the operation I'm reading something from that resource. I'm getting the resource. And there is also a promise behind that. The get method promises you won't change the resource by executing the get method. So, and there is, of course, there are ways to do REST services wrong. So whenever you find a REST service, which you execute a get on, and then you change the resource, then somebody is doing something wrong. Because the one of the key promises of the get method is don't change anything. That's different to post, put, and delete. They change it. If post doesn't necessarily have to change something, put or delete for sure change something. And there is the representation. That's the third part of the REST triangle that describes how the service returns their data. So, and for the website, cnn.com or bbc.com or whatever, the representation is HTML, which then is your browser goes ahead and brings that into a nice human readable form. So, and then you have the three characteristics of a REST interface, and the REST interface is your favorite website. So, and with every REST service in your company provided by a standard software, it's always the same picture. The REST API provides resources, right, which might be rows in a database table, which might be objects in an object store, which might be entities within some standard software. It provides methods, what to do with these resources. Typical is get, put, post, delete. And the REST services provide data in specific representation. Nowadays, there is one representation which is hip, which is modern, which is cool. And this is JSON, right? But it's also totally okay that a REST service returned their data in XML. So REST doesn't necessarily always mean JSON, right? It is so today, right? When you have a REST service, these more or less always return JSON. But this isn't necessarily the case. And a REST service can return almost everything: an image, HTML, XML, whatever, because that's a variable part of the REST triangle. But what you don't see here is when it's about the question what's exactly inside that data. You just the REST service just says, okay, you have a resource which is said which returns rows from a table, let's say from an employees table, and we have methods get and post, for instance, get, post, put, delete, or let's do all of them to read, to update, to delete, or to insert. And the representation is JSON. But there is no part here which describes what attributes does an employee have, what data types do these attributes have, are there constraints. That's not part of a REST definition. And that's exactly what I just talked about. That's where the industry and the standard committees are now working on to define standards to exactly fill those gaps. For REST, for these definitions, Swagger is something which is more and more accepted in the industry, which is then there to further define what's behind a RESTful service. But now, here comes the important part then, when you are about to work with a RESTful service, keep in mind that when you get an API description, you will get a resource, you will get a list of available methods, so somebody will tell you, you can call get, post, put, delete, and somebody will tell you this returns JSON. So, and that's actually, from a REST perspective, that's it. So now it's about you to ask the further questions. So what's inside the JSON? Does it return one rows, multiple rows? Which attributes are within the JSON? What's the description of the response, that is about you to ask, and hopefully you will get some meaningful response. So in the enterprise, a RESTful service might look like this one. So we have the emp table, and that's a RESTful service. So let's directly switch to Oracle REST Data Services. So when you are about to create a RESTful service on top of the Oracle database, on top of a table in the Oracle database, the way to go is to use Oracle REST Data Services, ORDS, so the same thing you are using as Apex Listener. And then, as I told this morning, there is a PL/SQL API. ORDS comes, so when you install ORDS, when you configure ORDS for your database, ORDS will install a PL/SQL package in your database, the PL/SQL package ORDS. ORDS. So, and that PL/SQL package will then contain procedures like enable schema, create module, create handler, create service. So that's a bunch of PL/SQL functions and procedures which allow you to create a RESTful service based on a table, view, SQL query, or a PL/SQL block. So with those functions and procedures, you can have a SQL query, select star from emp, and create a RESTful service based on that SQL query. So I once did that on one of. So I don't want to spend too much time on how to create those RESTful services. There are plenty of tutorials available, and I can provide you a lot of materials which describe how to do that. This part is Application Express and the rest of the world, so I would like to focus on the situations we have a RESTful service and we want to use this in Apex. Right? So this is our RESTful service. I created it with ORDS, and we have the resource, that's the URI. We have the method, that is get, and we have the representation. This is, as we all can see, JSON. So as we see, this is a JSON array, and for each row in our database table, we have an array element, and there is also some result metadata. It says there's nothing more than this. Limit is 25, so okay, if the emp rows would have contained more than 25 rows, we would only get 25, and then there would it would say has more true. That's a very important fact. I will talk about this. And then here is some described by. That's interesting. There is a described by link. So let's follow that. So it says the URL is a bit different now. It says ords.metadata catalog amp. Okay, so ORDS seems to provide some sort of a metadata catalog. That is not Swagger. So that's no standard. That's the ORDS style to describe a RESTful service. As I just said, that standards are developing. It's unlike SOAP, where there's a W3C standard, which exactly tells everybody, this is the way you have to do it. We don't have this for REST so far. All which is standardized for REST is URL, resource, a representation, method. That's all what the REST, when you hear REST, that's all what's standardized with REST, nothing more. So ORDS, the plan for ORDS is for future versions that ORDS will use Swagger as well. So the industry is moving towards Swagger. Swagger is also a JSON syntax which provides much more information than just this one. You see, ORDS at the moment provides a little bit of information, but actually it's not too much, right? We don't even see the length of the varchar. It's just, it says, okay, it's a number, date, or string, and I get some information about the primary key. That's all I get from that table. But it's better than nothing, and with a client application, you are now already able to process this and then having that information, we know how to process the response data. Okay, so that's how a typical REST response looks like. That's the Oracle example. Then, of course, on the internet, you will find a huge amount of RESTful services. There's one of my favorite examples I always like to use. That's the Earthquake JSON feed. Actually, this is not really a RESTful service. There is a resource which contains all JSON feed, a JSON feed with all earthquakes from the last day. But of course, there is no get put. there's no public get, put, or post or delete method. I'm pretty sure there might be a private one, which only USGS uses. But from the public point of view, we have one resource, which is the list of earthquakes in the last 24 hours. And then there is also a resource for the individual earthquake, and this is this one with the details. So this also pretty much makes up a REST API. But again, all which is standardized is resource representation method, not more. So when we want to know how to parse that, what attributes are these? How do I have to parse it? In that case, you would have to go to the website of USGS, and there is one section documentation, and then there is a lot of material you can walk through which describes all this. So again, to exactly know what's behind that RESTful services, you have to read, you have to inform yourself. Right? It's not like SOAP and WSDL, where it all comes automatically. Okay, so we know that about REST. So now let's think about, okay, how can we use that in Application Express? So let's go to the slides, go back to the slides a bit, and we have seen that. That is interesting before moving to Application Express. So these are the most common methods you will see when working with RESTful services. So the most common for sure is GET, read a resource. Typically, you have, for the GET method, you typically have two sorts of URL endpoints. There is typically one URL which points to the collection of resources, all the rows of the M tables, as we have seen this. And there is typically one sort of URI which exactly points to one single row. Typically, this has a primary key as part of the URL. This is the same for this earthquake thing, and this was also the same for the odds RESTful services. They pretty much all work the same. So then, with the post method, you typically create a resource. Very often, there are REST requests which allow to do more than just creating with post. Post is so if you don't know what method to use, typically you choose post, right? But the natural meaning of post is we are creating something. So if we are using a REST API to store a new row in the employees table, we would typically use a post request. Put is there to completely replace an existing resource, and that's important to know. Put completely replaces. So if again a REST API based on the M table, so you're now thinking about, okay, let's update the king record, and I just want to increase the salary or decrease the salary, whatever you want, and so you are executing a put request and just provide the new salary. What will happen? You will see the salary decreased and all attributes set to null, right? Because the resource is being replaced completely. Whenever you are executing a put request, you have to provide all attributes. That's true for almost all RESTful services. Delete removes a RESTful service that removes a resource, and patch is there to change a resource. So patch would be the correct method to do partial updates on a resource, but patch is not necessarily so easy because patch requires typically that you have some sort of a patching language. So the payload you are sending with such a kind of request will contain exact instructions what has to happen on the server. So increase salary and decrease commission or whatever. So most commonly patch is, I see patch implementations rather seldom, but those four are common and used almost everywhere. So that could be another example for a RESTful interface. So you have such an interface is pretty easy to build with orts on a table. So if you have a database table, for instance, with a blob column, and you want to have a RESTful service which allows to store files into the table, to get files and to remove files, it's pretty easy to build a REST API, and for a client, then that API will pretty much look like this. You have the resource, and we have two handlers for the GET method. One is the collection of documents, one is for individual documents. We will have a put handler to update a document. We will have a post handler to create a new document, and we will have a delete handler to delete an individual document. You could even think about a delete handler just on the collection. Would mean truncate table, right? Delete the collection is pretty clear what that means, right? So be careful what handlers to implement. So how now to use such RESTful services in Application Express? We assume that the REST service is already there. And the picture is typically that we have our APEX database, we have orts in front of the APEX database, as that's the APEX listener, and we have the browser with the end user. So then the database, APEX, will have to execute an HTTP request to the RESTful service, whatever this is, and the JSON or whatever will go back to APEX and has to be processed there. So that is the earthquake example again. And when we think about a report, then this is our goal, right? We have the JSON, and we want to have a nice classic or interactive report showing the data in a user-friendly form. We even, when we have it within the report, we can even think about doing some fancy formatting and preparing the data for the end user, just as Shakib just showed us. Okay, so the basic part is how to come from the left side to the right side. And in 5.1 today, this means more or less you have to do it manually. We will help you a bit with the packaged applications. And with 5.2, the direction is APEX does it all for you. So the technology-wise, the good news is that everything we need is already part of the database. We are in a good situation that we have the Oracle database, and everything what we need is there. So we can use APEX Web Services or very basic UTL HTTP. These are the pure SQL packages to do the web request. All right? So that brings us the JSON into the database. Okay. So we could even use web service references in Application Express, but honestly, these don't give you too much functionality. Web service references are great for SOAP, and they have really provided deep integration of SOAP web services into APEX, but for REST, honestly, they don't do too much. They just grab the JSON for you, and that's one core with APEX Web Service, so it is not that much of technology within that. The interesting part is we have the JSON, and we want to parse that and provide the data as a report, or we get XML data from other RESTful services. And the good news is that we have XML functions in the database, and since 12c, we have even JSON functions in the database, which allow us to parse JSON payloads very easily just by using SQL functions. So those of you who have worked with REST services before, they know this one. This is the APEX Web Service packages, and one function member in APEX Web Service is make REST request. It has a lot of parameters. Most often you don't need all these. What you really need is just the endpoint URL and the HTTP method. And then this function returns a CLOP, and that CLOP will then contain the JSON. Pretty easy, right? So, and then it's about to parse that JSON. So, and now let's have a look how that can happen the manual way. So, let me use the local instance that responds a bit more snappy. Yeah. So, and the best way to use to work with RESTful services in Application Express is to install a packaged application. And I would recommend to install the REST Client Assistant. And when we were in the 5.1 cycle, it was clear that we won't be able to get any REST functionality into APEX itself. But it was also clear that customers need a bit of help when dealing with RESTful services. I have got all the customer questions and I've seen the OTN, the questions on the OTN forum, help me, I want to access that RESTful service and I don't know how to parse the JSON, how to parse the XML, how to call the RESTful service. And what was really needed is some red thread, some guidelines which allow you to actually do the manual steps and for you to know what do I have to do when. So let's start that REST Client Assistant. So then there is some introductory text, some information. You are in the database. You're about to access external HTTP services. So there is a bit to do in the database itself. You need to have network ACLs in place. So your APEX engine must be able to perform an HTTP request into the network. So the DBA has to enable the APEX schema. So this is described in the documentation. When the RESTful services is behind the firewall, you need to set a proxy server in your application, otherwise you won't get far. And then the sample RESTful services, you need a RESTful service to work with. So we already have these, we don't bother with the sample service. And when you have read and understood this, you might click continue. Nothing to do here, it's just for you a heads up what to do before going on. Okay, so now we can add a REST service reference, and let's do the AMP example. So this I will now work with Oracle REST Data Services, and I don't have authentication. I provide the endpoint URL, and I hit next. So, and REST Client Assistant also shows us the JSON, so we can see, okay, the REST service responded with something, and what and REST Client Assistant it now asks that we can adjust the row selector. So the idea behind that is that the REST service responds with a collection of rows, and we have to tell this application which JSON element contains the collection. How is it named? And for ORDs, it's always items. We will see at the earthquake example, it might be different, right? And the response is JSON. So we are lucky, we can just hit add service reference. And then REST Client Assistant also parsed the response for us and created something which we call a data profile. So that's a mapping of JSON attributes to rows and columns of a virtual table. We want to use these data in APEX, so we have to come to a table representation. And that is our table representation for that RESTful service. So then we can hit save and finish. So now we have that REST Client Assistant. We can look into the details, and you can now see very nicely what REST Client Assistant does. So in APEX 5.1, we have to do it manually. I already said that. REST Client Assistant generates the code for you, right? Working with the RESTful service in the first step means I have to get the JSON. So you see here, it generates a PL/SQL block, which is doing APEX web service make REST request. We see the endpoint URL, we see the method, and it also does many REST services require to set the user agent HTTP header. So the code does that for us as well. And the response JSON is then stored in a collection. Okay, and what else do we have? That's the magic, the cool part. It generates a SQL query as the region source for us. And that query uses the SQL JSON functions which are there in the database. And that SQL query will parse the JSON for us and provide all the attributes as a table. So that's the region source for our report, actually. So we now should be able to create a report on top of that RESTful service just by doing a bit of copy and paste. So first, we need, now let me use an existing application that saves a bit time. Now we create a blank page. So what does it say? We have PL/SQL code on page load. It says take that PL/SQL code and create a process on page load, and so that's it. So when I now run the page, that process would fire upon page load, would grab the JSON data from the RESTful service and store it into the collection. The page would still be empty, of course. So then we need the region. Take that code. And now let's create a report on top of that. We need a SQL query. Now we can try it out. That's it. Classic report on a RESTful service. The data comes directly from the internet, just with a bit of copy and paste. Is that easy? So, of course, that's not our final goal for APEX, right? It's a helper for you. So if you have to work with a RESTful service today, this application might be a helper for you. And I'm pretty sure when you have integrated your first 5 RESTful services, you won't ever touch that application again, because then you know how to do it. And then you don't want to have generated code. You have your own code, right? And that's especially to get you through these first steps, because when really being exposed to these SQL JSON functions the very first time, it's hard. It takes a few hours to get a grip.
That application, is that in 5.1 also?
It's in 5.1 as well. Okay. So that's in 5.1 you have that application. You can just go to packaged applications, install it, and you are off to go. Important for the REST client assistant is, especially again, you are about to address a RESTful service behind the firewall or outside the firewall, then set the proxy server. Otherwise, it's a limited experience, right? So again, let's have a look now. When it's so easy, right? Why bothering? Let's have a look into another RESTful service. So here I have created a RESTful service on top of a data dictionary view. The resource URI is lying. It isn't user tab columns, it's all tab columns. This is select table name, column name, data type from all tab calls. That's the SQL query which powers that RESTful service. And again, we can scroll down. So, and that's the difference between this one and the end table. And in practice, in real life, you will very often see those kind of RESTful services. So it has a has more equals true. We get the first 25 rows, and here we get a link which says the next 25 rows are available here. So, and how this is handled is different from REST service to REST service. ORTS uses such an offset and limit parameters, so I can get more than 25 rows with one request when saying limit equals 500. Now I will get 500 rows. That's 500, so I want to have even more, 600. Oh, still only 500. So, and this applies to other RESTful services as well. So if you are about to work with a REST service, perhaps from an SAP system or whatever, you might, these REST services allow to request more than the default amount of rows, but they all have a limit at some specific point. For ORTS, the limit is by default 500 rows. You won't get more with a single request. The ORTS administrator now can go into ORTS settings and bump that limit up, right? But no administrator will bump it up to 10 million for you, right? So that's the basic message. When a REST service is working on a large amount of data, you won't get all data with one request. So you have to get used to the fact that you have to execute multiple requests to get everything you need, right? And that has consequences, right? When we think about our classic report example again. So for a classic report, this is simple. Wait a moment, is it really so simple? So let's assume these are not 14 rows of employees. So let's assume it's 1,000 rows, and we just got the first 25. So looks good at the first glance, but now I'm doing this one. All right? It's ridiculous. We cannot sort. We would need all rows to actually sort. Or what ORDS allows, we would need to pass an order by clause to the RESTful service. And again, that's something which ORDS allows. The same, by the way, is true for filtering. We want to filter by let's assume we have a job developer. So we know that there are developers in that company, but unfortunately not within the first 25 rows. So you filter by developer and you see no rows, right? When we only get a few rows back, we cannot work with them. And it's also not an option to request everything from the RESTful service. That might be okay for 1,000 rows. So with ORDS, that would mean 2 requests at a maximum. But think about an SAP system with an order table of 20 million. It just doesn't work, right? You cannot always request everything and work locally. Those RESTful services typically provide some sort of an API. So you can append syntax to the URL, requesting the RESTful service to filter by a specific attribute, or to order the results by a specific attribute as sending or descending. For ORDS, that syntax is documented. Other syntaxes, SAP and Microsoft, they also provide syntaxes. That syntax then looks different to ORDS. And you will have to look the documentation, and then you would learn, okay, append a question mark, and then order underscore by equals, and then some attribute name or whatever, right? So again, something to learn about the RESTful service. We would need not only the methods and the verbs and the representation. We don't have only to, we have to learn the attributes and the data types, and now we also have to learn what features, what capabilities does this REST service provide at all. Do I have to download all the data? Or is there some filter predicate, some order by, which I have to send to the RESTful service in order to work with this service? Things in practice are very often very easy. So many REST services then have a URL switch, which allow you to, or in many cases, you won't even deal with 10 million rows. And with the earthquake example, it's just the 500 rows and that's it. But you have to, when working with a RESTful service, you should just check all these questions. When there is a colleague who provides the RESTful service and you are about to integrate it in your APEX application, just have a phone call with the colleague and just check these questions, right? Then you know what's happening and you can go ahead. When you know that one request always returns all the data, you know you're on the easy track, right? If you know that you have to paginate, things get a bit more complicated. REST Client Assistant can also work with paginating, with ORDS services and pagination. So if you have a RESTful service, so let's at least configure this in REST Client Assistant once, but I won't do an application with this anymore. So just create a RESTful service reference. So we again have an ORDS service, that is the URL. So, and we see the JSON preview again. We will get the attributes, save and finish. Oh, this didn't have attributes. Did I do something wrong? Okay, again, ORDS. We have items. I know what's happening. now. It doesn't discover. Anyway, takes too much time. So actually, this should be able to. This should work, and this should also work with a table larger than the end table. Just go ahead. I'm pretty sure that this will work on your system. So anyway, in those cases, REST Client Assistant will generate the on-page load code again, but we cannot use in 5.1. We cannot use report pagination to paginate between the report results, because we always, when we have exhausted the rows we got with our request, we have to perform a new request to the RESTful service. And so for a REST service which returns more rows, REST Client Assistant will generate additional code how to add pagination buttons to your reports, right? And what PL/SQL code to execute with these buttons. And it's a bit more work then, but you can, using the REST Client Assistant, or the REST Client Assistant also helps you creating an application based on a RESTful service, which even works on a large amount of data with paginating through the RESTful service. That's all possible, that works. And the more of these client-server features you have to consider, the more complex it gets. And then we really reach the point where we say, oh, actually, we do want to have this in Application Express. And that's what we are working for in APEX 5.2. So now let's leave the manual approach. And by the way, for an interactive report, this wouldn't work at all, right? That is, interactive report has so many ordering. You don't have, for a classic report, we can very easily work with custom pagination buttons. For an interactive report, it's hard to work with custom pagination buttons because it all comes from interactive report. You would really have to get hooks into interactive report to make it working. So we are in a situation where we say, okay, we want to have this as a part of APEX. And that's what we are about to work on with APEX 5.2. So let's now go to shared components. And in the morning, I used shared components to create an ORTS remote database. And now I will use that to create a web source. So I will create a web source module. And again, this is ORTS, Oracle REST Data Services. And yes, let's take this example, not with the limit, but let's take the all tab calls. Let's take the example with the large amount of rows. So we will divide endpoint URLs into a server part and a service part. This will, so that you will be able to group RESTful services based on the remote server, which will hopefully make it easy to you if you are on development, working with a server providing development RESTful services, to just change the remote server object and thus redirecting all the RESTful services to the production system. So we don't have a remote server so far matching that then 01 BPJ URL. So it says create new. It splits up the URL into a server and a service URL part. For ORTS, this is pretty well. And we might adjust this. So if you say, no, the server part is just ORTS and the rest is service specific, you can change that. But for me, that's fine. It asks for authentication. No, we don't have authentication. And again, we want APEX to discover the RESTful service. And yes, it was able to discover the RESTful service. We see a sample of the response data. We see the attributes and columns. So it found 3 columns, all varchar2. And then you can even see more technical details. And then you can create the web source reference. So, and now let's start using that. delete another page. And now I will directly create a report. I will start with a classic report. And this is classic REST. So, and you have seen these wizard elements before. We are not working on the local database. We are not working on a remote database. We are working with a web source. And we want to use the all tab columns module. And we want to work on all 3 columns. And create. And now we have a classic report. And that is your classic report based on the RESTful service. And pagination is done with, so you don't have to worry about. Just 5 minutes ago, what did I tell you? Oh, you have to look for pagination. That might get complicated. You have to deal for this. You have to add custom pagination buttons to your report. And be aware that you might have to request additional rows. Right? APEX5.2, that's our goal. Will make you forget all that, right? You just create the report on top of that RESTful service and you are done. APEX knows that this is a RESTful service. APEX knows how to request rows from that RESTful service, and APEX does requests exactly the right amount of rows for you and displays it in the report. So then, okay, let's do the next thing. So let's remove that report. I'm too lazy to create a new one. A new page, and let's use an interactive report. And so we are working with a web source. Again, all tab columns. Page designer populates the columns within the tree, and save that. Run, and we will have an interactive report. So, and now we can say audit. So we are looking for all rows containing audit. And that's very interesting what happened here. This query actually would return 60,000 rows or so. I once counted it. And APEX didn't fetch all the rows. APEX took the search, the user input, and passed it to orts as a filter expression. So I told you orts allows to pass filter expressions to the RESTful service to have a filter executed on the server side, which is important on large amounts of data. And APEX did use exactly this, right? So that audit has been translated to a filter syntax specific for orts, and orts just returned that amount of rows. And that allows us to very nicely integrate the RESTful service within the interactive report. So we can use the interactive report as if we were on a local database. End users can search, end users can order. So we can order this. And of course, that's what we have to keep in mind. This is like on a local table. It dynamically generates this list of values, and of course it uses the RESTful service for that. Now I'm ordering by the column name column, right? And again, the order by expression as well as the search expression has been passed to the RESTful service, and the RESTful service delivered just the amount of rows we needed, right? And this works on regardless how much rows this REST service potentially is working on, right? And so that's what we learned with the REST Client Assistant. That's what we learned when we were through designing and discussion phases. How can we implement RESTful services in APEX? APEX really needs to have an understanding of the RESTful service. APEX also, what we just discussed, different RESTful services have different capabilities. Some REST services always return all rows. Some have a pagination syntax. Some allow to filter to order by. APEX must have an understanding of this, right? APEX must know about this, and then APEX can leverage it by translating an end user order by command and translate it to the appropriate orts command to get exactly the right amount of rows from orts. Okay, let's now, how much time do I still have? How much? Nothing. I'm out. So one last demo, and that's the it's a ready-to-use example. We don't even need to create it. But it's the localhost example. Wait a moment. Right. So here I use the earthquake example, which I already have shown you. Created a web source reference from it, and then created an interactive report. Right. And this is an interactive report in action based on a RESTful service. So we can use the highlighting stuff. We can filter. You have seen that before. We can even use chart feature, and this is all not from an internal table. All the data comes from a JSON feed, right? And for the end user, this interactive report looks like a local table. It's almost no difference. Group by. We even have computations defined. Let me go to the report view again. And here are the computations. So we converted one attribute of the RESTful service from a number to a date. So all these features are available, just the data source is different. And now I think you might have an understanding of what we are targeting to with this data source stuff I talked about this morning. So an APEX component can be, like it was before, a local database, the local schema, just SQL as we always did. It can be a remote database and can be a web source. And as for remote databases, the plan is to provide that for read-only components like classic report, interactive report, calendar, and charts for 5.2. Maybe perhaps one component more, but we definitely won't make all APEX components in 5.2. Other components will have to wait for the next release after 5.2. I hope you like it, and thank you for your attention, and sorry for overdrawing. Thank you.